Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual NBC6 Voices on our Facebook and YouTube pages. I'm Jawan Strader. Well, tonight we are taking a look at Florida's proposed anti-rioting legislation. Florida's House Bill 1, dubbed the Combating Public Disorder or Anti-Riot Bill, passed in the Florida House earlier this month after a heated debate that lasted more than 4 hours. The controversial measure creates new crimes related to violent protests, enhances riot-related penalties, and makes it harder for local governments to reduce police spending. Now, the House bill was sponsored by Miami Republican Representative Juan Fernandez Barquin in the wake of last summer's demonstrations after George Floyd's death. Opponents of the legislation say it goes too far and criminalizes civil disobedience. Now, before becoming law, the bill must still pass in the Senate before the session ends at the end of this month. So with us now to talk a little bit more about the bill is community organizer Tiffy Burks. I want to say Tiffany, Tiffy Burks. Hello. We also have with us Rachel Gilmer. She's co-director of the Dream Defenders, and Melba Pearson. She's a former state director, or state prosecutor rather, and deputy director of the Florida American Civil Liberties Union. She's now the director of policy and programs for FIU Center for Administration of Justice. Welcome all. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, Melba, let's get right to it. Well, Governor Ron DeSantis announced proposed legislation to combat violence, disorder, and looting while protecting law enforcement officers back in September of last year. So what was the ACLU's reaction?
Yeah, so just looking generally at this entire proposed bill and this entire course of action, I can assure you as a former prosecutor that this was a solution in search of a problem. We have a large number of laws that are applicable if, God forbid, we had another situation like the Capitol riots, or if we had situations that were seen in other states where there was a vast amount of unrest around social justice issues. So there is no shortage of laws to be able to address any issues that may arise as a result of a protest. But additionally, what is so very disingenuous and troubling about this law is, number one, it's been billed as a reaction or a response to the events that occurred at the Capitol. Meanwhile, the governor had very clearly messaged last summer when protesters were out there raising their voices around the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and folks were out there raising their voices in a peaceful manner. And on one hand, the governor is bragging on Fox News that we don't have these types of problems in Florida, and there was no unrest or problems with regards to the protest. But then on the other hand, he's using these very right-wing talking points in saying that this is about law and order, and this is about, making sure what happened in other jurisdictions doesn't happen here. But it didn't. So at the end of the day, if God forbid it did, we have laws. And now it's very clear that from the economic impact, that this bill is horrible for the state of Florida in so many different ways, especially in silencing the First Amendment rights of people to raise their voices around concerns about policing and their government.
Well, let's bring in some other panelists here. Tiffy, as we mentioned, the measure has passed in the House, but not yet in Florida Senate. So what would you like to see happen while the legislature is still in session?
What we would like to see happen is we obviously want the bill SB 484 to be killed. We don't want it to be passed into law. Kind of what Melba already mentioned on this bill. This bill is unconstitutional. It's ambiguous on how it's going to be implemented, and it's a fiscal disaster. And so taking all those things into consideration, we really would like to see during this legislative session that the bill actually be voted down. So we're asking everybody in the Appropriations Committee to vote no on it. So it doesn't even have to go to the Senate floor to be voted on. So that's kind of what we would like to see.
Well, Rachel, some critics describe the bill as anti-Black. Do you agree?
I do. Dream Defenders was founded in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder by George Zimmerman, and young people came together across the state of Florida in the spirit of the civil rights movement and built a generational movement against racism and white supremacy. And, for the killing of Trayvon Martin, because of Stand Your Ground, because of our racist criminal justice system, George Zimmerman did not spend a day in prison. And under this law, if someone pulls down a Confederate flag, a symbol of racism, a symbol of slavery, that person would serve 15 years in prison. So what that means is under HB 1, Governor DeSantis's top priority this legislative session, people who kill protesters will be protected, and that, people who, that this law basically gives more rights to statues than to Black people and people who are protesting. This bill is a direct response to the racial justice movement that was spurred by George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, their murders this summer. And we experienced the largest uprising in US history. And in Florida, we saw action across the state, just like we did across the country. And so when you ask, what do we want our politicians to do? We want our politicians to address the issue of racist policing in this country. And we want our communities, instead of our politicians to be focused on criminalizing protesters, on criminalizing people speaking out, we want our politicians to actually deal with the problem of racism itself, to deal with the problem of racist policing, to deal with the fact that we are living in a global pandemic, and Governor DeSantis would rather figure out how to give his rich friends access to the vaccine than make sure Floridians have access to unemployment, have access to the vaccine, have access to healthcare, have access to the basics. And so what we need from our senators, from our legislators, from the people who represent us is to actually listen to the needs of everyday Floridians rather than focusing on criminalizing us and silencing anybody who disagrees with the governor.
Well, very passionate. I'm sure Melba wants to add to that because Melba, Dr. Rick Harper at the University of West Florida conducted a study that found the price of this bill has some pretty staggering results. So can you explain to our viewers what they are?
Sure. So Dr. Harper heads up a center in the University of West Florida that is nonpartisan and really measures the economic effects, the economic impacts of some of these bills. So when this bill was introduced, it was billed as, oh, well, there's not going to be any fiscal blowback with regards to this. However, he found that this bill will have an impact of between $25 million and $67 million a year impacting Floridians. So this is your tax dollars basically going to subsidize something that's not really a problem, right? We have not had quote unquote violent protest. And if we did, we have laws to address it. So by creating this entire new carve out of statutes and minimum mandatories, it's going to cost the taxpayers money from the standpoint of longer incarceration times. Because when someone's incarcerated, our tax dollars pay for the person to be able to have food and all of that, the salaries of the corrections officers, et cetera. It also measures the fact that people now, if they're in the system, they can't work. So what does that mean? That means lost income. That means families scrambling to try to, put food on the table. And so that is a long-term impact that again ends up being shifted to the taxpayer. So it is very clear, and especially Republicans and independents and libertarians love the fiscal argument. Here is the fiscal argument as to why this bill does not need to be passed. We don't have a problem, and it's going to cost the taxpayers a ton of money, especially when we're coming out of a pandemic. We have not gotten the tourism dollars over the course of the last year. So it's a fiscally irresponsible move to pass this bill in the Senate.
And what is his prediction for the number of people, Melba, that will be arrested each year?
So he's came up with numbers that were around 700 folks to something around 200 to maybe 270 to about 700 folks a year would be arrested and potentially convicted under this law. So you're looking at upwards of 1,000 Floridians a year who are going to be put in the system unnecessarily. Because again, this is creating a new class of crimes. It's not enhancing, anything that's already existing. So that is, again, when you think of that many people being taken out of the community, and now when you come back with that scarlet letter of conviction on your chest, it's very difficult to get a job. It's very difficult to be able to get housing, and they're ineligible for certain types of housing. You're not going to be able to get student loans. So there's all of these, different, outcomes that are very negative for people, and that in the long term impacts our community. Because again, if you have less people working, less people who are educated, then that's more people who may end up in the criminal justice system, which means more survivors of crime, basically more victims. And at the end of the day, none of this benefits our community, especially since we did not have a problem to begin with.
Well, Tiffy, okay, let's play devil's advocate here, Tiffy. You know why? Because supporters of this bill, they say it's about public safety. They say it's about cracking down on protests that escalate to violent riots. So do you take issue with that?
Absolutely, I do, because we know the facts prove that overwhelmingly the amount of protests that have happened have been completely safe. Let's talk about the protest that we planned in downtown Fort Lauderdale on May 31st. We had over 3,000 people out there in the city of Fort Lauderdale, and we kept our people safe. We had police liaisons, we had safety liaisons, we had people trained, hundreds of volunteers trained, and everybody was safe at the protest. And the moment that violence happened was after our protest ended and people were walking to their cars in the city of Fort Lauderdale. The Fort Lauderdale Police Department opened up fire and shot rubber bullets to our innocent protesters. So we know how to keep our people safe when we protest, and we've done it time and time again. So the issue is not with the protesting, because we know how to do that. And the issue is when police officers come in afterwards. So that's what we have to worry about when it comes down to safety, but it's not our own people and it's not our own folks. So protesting is overwhelmingly a safe activity to do. And we've seen it again, not only in the city of Fort Lauderdale, not only in South Florida, but across the country, of people keeping their people safe while out on the streets.
Well, Rachel, do you see the bill as a way to roll back the constitutional rights to free speech and protest?
Yeah, that's exactly what it does. Essentially what DeSantis wants to do is censor anybody who disagrees with him, plain and simple. He wants to punish protesters with jail time for up to 15 years with no bail just because they disagree with him. This is about censoring people's voices. This is also about taking away people's voting rights, censoring our votes. We know that in Florida, if you make protesting a felony, that could take away someone's right to vote. And this isn't the only way that DeSantis is trying to censor people right now. He is also pushing SB 90, which is a voter suppression bill. It is like the voter suppression bills we are seeing move in Georgia and Texas and all across the country by the right wing. We also see the way that he treats reporters. Anytime a reporter asks him a question, he calls them a liar and just figures out a way to deflect their questions. We even see the way that he's been trying to, fight ballot initiatives that Floridians have voted for. Last election, the majority of Floridians voted to pass $15 minimum wage. And what was the first thing that DeSantis did this legislative session? He put forth a bill to try to roll it back. And so over and over and over again, we are seeing the ways that DeSantis is trying to censor the voices of everyday Floridians and people who disagree with them. Freedom of speech, the right to stand up for our ideas. These are basic American ideals. And DeSantis wants to move as a dictator. He's like, any Floridian who disagrees with me, I'm going to figure out a way to completely silence them, completely take away their, ability to be a part of the political process. And in a moment like this, when our communities are facing so many crises, this week was Derek Chauvin's trial, and we saw witness after witness, in tears over the horrors of witnessing George Floyd's murder. We know a Black person is killed by the police every 27 hours. Florida ranks #1 often in terms of police killings. And not only that, our communities are facing a huge crisis in the wake of COVID, high unemployment, a failing unemployment system at the hands of the governor. People who have lost loved ones to COVID, people who have lost their home. Somebody was actually killed by the police today when they were being evicted from their home in Miami. So all the crises that our communities are facing, Floridians deserve the right to have a say over how these crises are addressed through the ballot, through protest, through the basic ways that people make sure their voices are heard in this system. And it is absolutely disgusting that our governor's priority, rather than actually addressing these crises, rather than actually responding to the needs of Floridians, is to figure out how to silence us. It is disgusting, and we need as many people to come out and speak against this as possible, especially over the next week. If you're interested in getting involved, you can go to hb1.org and sign the stophb1.org and sign the petition, because we really have to figure out a way to stop this, or else, it's going to have long-term implications for our ability as people in our communities to make sure our voices are heard in the political process and make sure our needs are met.
Yeah, we see what long-term effects Stand Your Ground has had, and we've seen the consequences from that, which still exist today, and a lot of confusion and everything else when it comes to it as well. So, Melba, I want to ask you, the bill was amended to clarify that only people engaged in a violent protest can be arrested and charged, but it doesn't define what a peaceful protest is. So how can that be problematic? And you're an attorney. I mean, you have this legal mind. So tell us, how could this be problematic?
Sure. So whenever you leave something very vague and up to interpretation, that means that it can be interpreted differently depending on the situation. That means that people will be treated differently. So for instance, what we may see as a protest here in Miami, sort of like large gathering of people chanting, singing, that sort of thing. And then you have one person who was not connected to the protest, who was not there, with the intent to raise their voice, acting in an inappropriate manner. Under this bill, the organizers of the protest could be held criminally liable, even though their intention was not to cause any violence or to have a violent outcome, right? And so it gives this whole list of like, well, you have to, basically say, all right, I rebuke any responsibility with regards to the protest, and you have to walk away and throw your hands up, which is not even remotely logical when you think through how a protest plays out. It's usually a lot of people, and then by the time you're trying to walk away, the police may already be there and you end up getting arrested, right? So it does not take into consideration really the intent of the people that organized the protest. It just looks at, somebody acted a fool at a protest and did something that was violent, therefore let's hold the organizers liable, as opposed to the individual who may have necessarily caused the problem. And then also, I just want to put a finer point on this, Jawan, for your viewers. If somebody comes to a protest and then throws, a Molotov cocktail, or something that would set a business on fire, there's a charge called arson that currently exists at Florida law, right? So, and that's a charge I've used a number of times as a prosecutor. So if you were to set fire to a business while you're at a protest, there's already a charge that exists that can be placed against you. If you break into a business, that's called a burglary. That exists here in Florida. That is an existing statute, right? If you were to attack a police officer, there's already minimum mandatories in place, 3-year minimum mandatories and 5-year minimum mandatories, depending on the level of your aggression towards the officer, right? So we have an entire cadre of statutes and laws that can be used to address any criminal behavior that occurs. So to create this whole other body of laws and minimum mandatories at a cost of up to $67 million to the taxpayers, listen, the current laws are free and they work. Okay. So again, this is a problem in search of a solution. And the vagueness is just going to cause more issues down the road. And the governor and his staff, his attorney general, all of them will have to defend lawsuits on First Amendment grounds because of the fact that this bill is unconstitutional, plain and simple. And that's going to be money to be lost from the taxpayers as well.
And you know how ironic that 53 years ago this week, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down in Memphis. So, Melba, critics say that legislation like this would have criminalized his activities and those like the late John Lewis. So what are your thoughts about that, Melba?
I fully agree with that. And one thing that I want to highlight is that, we look at Dr. King now and we're like, oh, he's this hero, he's this bastion of nonviolence. But if you look back at the media coverage of his protests and his work during that time, he was one of the most hated people at the time in America. He had maybe a 30 to 40% approval rate while he was leading these nonviolent marches. And, there's one very poignant comic or cartoon that showed him in an interview with a journalist and saying, and the journalist basically being like, so how's the protest going? And, everything's on fire behind him and all of that. Because again, there was this whole narrative of him being, anti-American, he's a communist, he's violent, the same things we're hearing today. So while people are now giving Dr. King his flowers, nearly 60 years later, at the time, they wanted to kill him for speaking out against these issues that in a way we take for granted. So now, as we look at the fact that history has a habit of rhyming, we're back into the same scenario where we're looking to criminalize the current Dr. Kings that are raising their voices against inequities and doing so in the most disgusting manner and the most disingenuous manner, saying that it's about public safety when it's really not.
Amen. So very true. Thank you so much for that little history fact, Melba. And I want to thank all of you for your very passionate conversations. Rachel, very passionate. Thank you so much. Tiffy, thank you so much. And I saw a little person in the background, Tiffy, walking by. So I know you have a little backup in case anybody wants to mess with you back there at home. So I thank you so much. And Melba, as always, we really appreciate your insight, especially your legal insight. Thank you all for joining me this evening for this all-important conversation.
Thank you, Jawan.
So much for having us.
You got it. Well, everyone, before we go, we want to take a moment to remember a pioneer, Congressman Alcee Hastings, who passed away today following a battle with pancreatic cancer. Hastings was Florida's first Black federal judge, a position he held for 10 years. Hastings spent his career as a lawyer and later 15 terms in Congress fighting for civil rights. Now, he was not perfect like many of us. No one is. So his career was also mired in controversy. He was impeached and removed from the federal bench in the 1980s over his role in a bribery scandal, but it didn't stop him from fighting for equality. His congressional colleagues, like Representative Frederica Wilson, she tweeted today that he leaves behind an enormous legacy for future generations to cherish and emulate. Alcee Hastings was 84 years old. And also, a final tribute to another South Florida original. A portion of Northwest 14th Avenue between 62nd and 67th Streets in Miami are now known as Betty Wright Lane. The legendary singer from Liberty City died last year. Wright was best known for her songs Clean Up Woman and No Pain, No Gain. Wright died last year at the tender age of 66. She will be missed, but her legacy lives on. But that's our show for tonight. You can always watch this program this Saturday morning on NBC6 at 9:30 a.m. And be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook. I'm at Jawan NBC6. And you can also message us on social media if you have a story idea. And before we go, remember, education is the key to success. If you believe, you will succeed. We'll see you next time. Have a great week.